So we have plenty of time for discussion, and I guess I will start us off by saying that as people think about the law and policy, we often encounter, and this came to the table again and again in this panel and in the previous panel, we often encounter this dilemma of whether to, sorry for my blunt Israeli language, whether to sleep with the enemy, because, you know, the enemy is a big corporation, he pollutes the world, he exploits employees, etc., etc. But if he collaborates with our small NGO for small farmers, then maybe, you know, we're not going to beat them, then let's join them. Let's take some of the crumbs from the big pie that the corporation holds. So just to give you an example, I teach in the Human Rights Clinic in Tel Aviv. It's one of my duties. And we got an approach. We're approached by Palestinian-Israeli clients. They said, we wanted to get into a club, and they screened us because we are Arabs. So why won't you represent us? And of course, this is a classical case for a human rights clinic. So we sat down with them, and then it turns out that the club that they were not admitted to is a strip club. So now what do? You're a human rights clinic. Do you, forget what the club is and just fight the racism or nationalism? Or do you say, listen, I have my priority list and it's kind of odd that I'm going to help you enter a place that objectifies and exploits women? So I guess my question to the wonderful presenters, my first question would be, where do you stand on that? What is your way of thinking? You know, do I talk with Monsanto and make them nicer, or do I fight Monsanto like there's no tomorrow? By the way, Monsanto is now being courted heavily by the Israeli government, which is always after foreign investors. And we have luckily managed to be out of this matrix, the Israeli farmers, pretty much. But if we don't take the experts in this room, if we don't take a firm stand and voice it to our government, that might be different very, very soon. So that's my question, please. And then I'll open, after the first round, I'll open the questions to the audience.
Yes. I think so. I'm going to answer it slightly.
You can take the microphone out of the stand.
Yeah. I'm going to try and... I was at a meeting 2 weeks ago on addiction, and we had the cigarette companies and the alcohol companies and the drug manufacturers and, prescription drug manufacturers, as far as I know. Cannabis was there, but not officially. Yeah, you could smell it. And WHO actually walked out. They got up and walked out because the cigarette companies were there. I was chairing it. And the question that arose for me was, should we be there talking to the cigarette companies that have killed so many millions of people? Or the alcohol companies that have killed so many millions of people, frankly? Or should we say we won't talk to you because of what you're doing? We were actually starting to talk about e-cigarettes and if they were better or worse than traditional smoking and the evidence for it being a slippery slope, which I won't go into now. But what is it? You've asked the same question, basically. Should we be talking to Monsanto as a cigarette manufacturing company? Or should we say we don't talk to you because of what you've done? And to me, the answer is very clear. You talk to everybody.
I was just going to say, I think I closed a bit with that as an NGO. I think we talk to them, and I think part of it is, you should sleep with your enemy in order to be able to make change. I think the second thing is that you need to bring a voice to the smallholder farmers, and that's where civil society as well, because these are both the consumers and your next economic market. And that voice and that experience and the needs and the benefits, have to be brought in the same way that the university needs to actually be practical and has to have implementing solutions. So I can say very much so. That doesn't mean we have to be in support of everything that happens, but we have to speak with a voice, and we do definitely have to negotiate for what is actually needed in reality on a day-to-day basis.
Actually, the reason I'm half asleep is I just came back from San Diego, where there was the big convention of BIO, which is the American Biotechnology Manufacturers. And I gave a talk there similar to the one I gave here, actually, about what is needed in the developing world, and that they should find there was markets. Of course, one of the slides I showed was a bunch of mice in a cage, and one of the mice, and the scientists were looking at the cage, and one of the mice was Mickey Mouse. And I said, as far as the developing world's needs, what you've done so far is Mickey Mouse. And there are needs that have to be met. Yes, you have to work with them. They still don't understand that there is a market there. My line to them is you have to understand that not to do this for philanthropy, because usually in the companies, the persons dealing with philanthropy are people they couldn't use in other parts of the company. And you have to have the people who understand that there's a real market out there. And but the companies really don't understand. The best examples, I think, is Monsanto in South Africa. When they released BT cotton, they told it clearly, we're trying to sell to the rich white farmers. Who took it up more quickly? The poor farmers, because they don't like to spray with a backpack sprayer, organophosphate insecticides. They didn't learn the lesson when they came out with herbicide-resistant maize. Also, their idea was for the rich white farmers. And a lady discovers that she can spray down 2 hectares in a day where she couldn't hoe 1 hectare in a month. And so the uptake there again. So they really don't understand their markets, and that's a big problem too. And I don't know how you explain that to them. Did you want to make you want to say
yeah, well, no, I don't represent Syngenta, remember. But I'd make the point that, but I'm a bit concerned about the language, though, you know, sleeping with the enemy. We've just heard, I mean, I must say, you know, we've heard about what? We've got Mexican drug cartels, I guess we can say they're the enemy. Your tobacco companies, I suppose so. Maybe they are unethical. I don't know. You know, I guess it's still a legal industry, isn't it? And then we have large agribusiness. Then we have Netafim. Are we saying Netafim is the enemy? Where are we drawing the line here? You know, in terms of private sector investment. And of course, there are people out there who object to technology, and some people object to multinationals, and maybe they get the two confused, or they should at least. What do they actually object to? But I think, you know, we just heard a great story. Also, remember, it is true actually. You know that smallholder farmers in South Africa grow Monsanto products, and they get benefit out of it. I completely agree that the large companies, and I could include Syngenta into it, need to learn an awful lot about engaging with smallholder farmers, and they can do. But the fact that they are not familiar with smallholder farming, I'm not sure puts them necessarily into the camp of the enemy. So I think we should be a bit careful about the... obviously, we could talk about power imbalances, and it's interesting, we heard from Africare, you know, smallholder farmers can be buyers and they can be sellers. And when they're selling, for sure, there's a huge imbalance in power between the buyer and the seller in that case. Whether there is in the other way, when the smallholder is a buyer, it could be. I don't know. We could talk about power imbalances, but I think we ought to be. Obviously, what we were interested in is engaging with the private sector. And I think the case is very well made that we have to think about how do we capture the voice of the smallholder? How do they get organised? How do they voice their own opinions? But just can be a bit careful with the language. Thank you.
I wanted to make the one more follow-up too, which is the who is the we, right? So I put on my hat and said, well, we as the NGO should be talking to Monsanto. Let's just use that as the example of the evil empire, which I don't agree with, but we shall use that. But the we is, what are the governments saying? Because if the smallholder farmers are saying one thing, and the government of Senegal or the ministry of Senegal is saying another thing, or the private sector in Senegal is saying a different thing, then especially around this issue of IP and licensing rights, it's very, very hard. And so the we is, there's several different of us at the table. So that is in the same way that there's several different evil empires out there, who is the we? And it's you know, in Africa it can be the question of the Chinese in Africa, and how do you talk to governments? And how does the government talk back? And what do you say as your conditions are? So I think that needs to be specified as well.
Thank you. So the floor is yours, please. Yes.
I would like to ask two questions.
You can present yourself.
Yes,
Everybody
okay.
speaks.
Javier Equal, I work for Biodiversity International in Rome. And the first question is for the more agronomic Eitan and Jonathan, and maybe Ian from your past history, if you can. I was listening to a presentation a few weeks ago from a Monsanto high manager, and he was saying that the next new barrier in biotechnology is RNA interference, and with that they are going to be able to manipulate the metabolism of almost any organism. And so he was saying, you know, it's the new era for pest disease control, because we will be able, you know, and he was showing some of things that they were doing. So my first question is that really feasible, and is that as good as he's selling it? For instance, in Eugene 99, could we just sequence the genome of this pathogen and then develop a molecule that will inhibit its... The second thing is, apparently, the studies say that today no public university, no public research system is being able to invest in research and equipment as much as the life science company. So in the next 10, 50 years, the public sector will have to engage in partnerships, like it or not, with life science. And what does it mean for research and the small farmers? And my last question for the for the lawyers is the value of any patent system or IP protection system depends on being able and possibility. And if you're selling 5 kilos or 2 kilos to small farmers in Africa or in Central America, how do you enforce a patent system or a patent protection system?
Thank you. Maybe we'll collect a few and then we'll answer. So
good afternoon. My name is Prince Emmanuel. I'm from the African Boreholes Initiative in Kenya. We are and I don't know where I fit in this discussion when we're talking about whacktivists and I'm not talking loud enough for people to hear me. I don't think I missed that. Oh,
it's for the
thank you. We have created some. We specialize beyond boreholes in organic farming, only organic farming, and we created something called the Organic Farmers Kit, which includes a drip system irrigation from net to film, greenhouse irrigation, quarter-acre open field, all organic inputs. Something very important for us is an agro support contract where you have one of our agronomists assigned to your farm once you acquire it. So we try to be very complete and comprehensive in the approach to assist the small farmer. Now, I mention organics in particular because when I hear us talk about the ethics, it seems here we're talking about legal ethics primarily. But I think what much of the opposition to genetically modified varieties, etc., comes from a human ethics standpoint. That actually the human body might not be, there's a question whether the human body is calibrated to turn this genetic material into proper food and energy for the human body. You can eat a number of things, but you don't turn it into the most effective fuel for your body becomes the question. So it's not a legal question for many, and that might explain the energy behind some of the opposition. Could that be the case? That's not the case.
Yeah, let's take one last question for this round, and then we'll
Shall we sleep with the enemy? This is always a nice starter. But sorry, I don't want to go into detail, but what is it, what we're doing then while we're sleeping with Yen? So, no, and let me go get clearer here. I think if it is working with Monsanto, and you basically help them selling their stuff.
So, hello. So if it would be just like an NGO, a development organization, a government or so, helping Monsanto to sell their stuff to farmers, I would say, hang on a second, that's not the idea. So are they bringing something to the table? Did we test the stuff they kind of want to sell? Are they giving it on a subsidized level? Are they going to chip in a couple of other things into it? Then there should be eventually some talk about it. And otherwise we say, thank you, there is better people to work with. And I think a lot what I saw working for some years in the CG centers, researchers were happy to eventually get co-finance from multinational seed companies. They were happy to help, but they talk the same language because it's about genetical improvement and this kind of stuff. And at the end, nobody from these research organizations sat down on the table and negotiated hardly and said, what are you bringing to the table? Yeah. So this is a bit where I think we should kind of define what we do in bed.
We have so many great takes on this question, so please.
To answer the question about RNAi and Monsanto, first of all, the technologies come from two companies here in Israel that Monsanto bought. And nobody really knows what they're doing. It's all in stealth right now. But the RNAi technology can only be used to turn genes off, can't be to put new genes in. And what has been published in the past is using it to suppress various insects, parasites, diseases. The publications in the past never give sufficient control that the farmers would want. So we don't know what they're doing. The technology is not proven in the peer-reviewed literature, but they've spent billions on it, so there must be something coming, we hope. The claim is that they're going to use the RNAi technology in such a way that they're synthesizing with synthesizers the RNAi itself so that it's a chemical and not a transgene. That's going to be a very interesting one for you to handle. This is a chemical. It's not a nucleic acid. It's not a natural product. So we don't really know what they're going to do, how they're going to register this, what's going to happen. You had another agronomic question, which was? Okay, I think I've done enough on that one.
I think enforcement. Yes, enforcement is a major issue, and the U.S. Trade Representative is spending at least 2/3 of their time in Africa trying to set up enforcement systems which are actually proving extraordinarily counterproductive. They've tried it on seed, they've tried it on music, they've tried it on books, and frankly, the only thing it's done is to ensure that people copy more. And nothing else. But they are pushing very hard. There was an attempt to pass a new international treaty called ACTA. I don't know if you've seen it, but if you read it, do sit down, do take an anti-heart attack pill before you do, because it must be one of the worst pieces of international legislation I've ever seen. I opposed it. The European Parliament turned it down, so it's fallen away, but it could easily come back. It was negotiated in secret between Australia, the United States, and the European Union. The European Union's pulled out for the time being. But have a look at that sort of thing, because the issue of, as you point out, the issue of enforcement is major. You're not going to enforce IP rights for many, many farmers very easily. even in the United States, let alone Africa. So what you've got to do is to make it worth the farmer's while. And that was the point about licensing. You've got to make it worth the farmer's while to use your seed. Johnny's point was that we can get massive improvements in yield simply by using proper, effective seed. That costs. You can't keep it for the next year because it doesn't work the next year very often. So it costs, and farmers have to be assured that it's worth buying it. It's as simple as that, and I think that assurance, as was pointed out with the cotton farmers, particularly in the Makateni Flats in South Africa, they bought it. They stopped buying it, but that's another issue, due to failure of crops. But initially, they thought it was the best thing since sliced bread.
There was a point, you make a point about the balance between public and private R&D. That was the point. I wrote it down. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think we need to look for the complementarities and the win-wins in this. The public sector has skills, has access to germplasm, has access, it can do work which is pre-competitive. So we very much believe in putting together partnerships between public sector R&D and private sector R&D that can be win-wins. And I guess the downside of that is that we also have a responsibility to monitor the results of that actually benefits the people we want to benefit, I think, downstream. And just this other point about, back to Monsanto and their stuff, if we're just helping sell it. Remember, we made the point, people buy products because they generate value for them. I think you're right. If we're using public funds to leverage a private sector engagement, yeah, of course, let's do deals. Let's see what we can get, put into the partnership. But I still think it's slightly strange. The other thing I was to say is that, to me, where we are now, the status quo is unethical. The lack of investment is fundamentally unethical. I also have real problems with the idea that we want to prevent choice. We haven't talked about choice, and you mentioned the point, farmers stop buying the seed. They have the choice. They can stop buying the seed, and it is, you'd be surprised, how much of the value in seed is captured by the farmer. Of course, they take all the risks. That's another issue, but and we need to manage those risks. But I still, I don't know. Some parts of this concern me. This argument that they're in there for profit. Of course, they're in there for profit. They're the private sector. That's why they're there. But I mean, they're also the people who are providing the products. Where we are, the current situation is not tenable. And it's not ethical, and the public sector can play its role, but it has a very bad track record of developing products for farmers.
I'd like to actually comment on that and give an example how it actually works. When we developed this technology for Striga and BASF finally registered it, and Rockefeller Foundation did the initial funding of the project, the idea was that NGOs gave the seed to farmers with the agreement that it'd be only for 1 year. After that, they had to buy it. And they did buy it. That generated enough money to buy it. And one of the major seed companies, a private seed company, not the public seed companies, interesting, Kenya Seed didn't provide credit to farmers, but a private seed company did. And he collected his money 4 months later, which was a good deal. So that works there too. The other thing they did, which is something that's illegal in the United States, is they bundled. You could only buy the seed if you bought fertilizer with it, because the farmer had to be convinced the seed was worthless unless you had a little bit of fertilizer with it. And there in Africa, the fertilizer is expensive. They put it out with a spoon on each hill. So that's how it works, and it can work. So this is basically a project that started from the public sector, me and Simmet, and Rockefeller's help, ended up in the private sector with a chemical company supplying materials to seed companies. And the seed companies are the only ones who can sell the material. So that's actually a protection of intellectual property without any IP rights at all, because nobody has IP rights on either of the technologies there.
Just I guess wanted to bring up a couple other things in that, because I think there's a point about sustainability here, right? So there's a point about people being actually able to have access, and it's not just seed. There's other things that IP rights covers around technology and so forth. So one point I wanted to bring up was a bit around this piece around training. And I think Ian and I were talking this morning. I think they're called micro, where it's not just here's your seed or here's your technology, but here a bit like here's the rest of what you need to be able to figure out if this is a profitable use of this particular input in your time. So I think that piece of whether you call it technological support, whether you call it from the public sector side extension worker training, I think is very important. The second piece that's very important is financing that's sustainable for the long term. And it can't just be that somebody, Bill and Melinda Gates and Rockefeller, is dumping down money every year that's allowing that to happen. It has to be, in Senegal we have a scheme where one of it's called Credit Mutual Senegal gives loans. It's a loan guarantee fund. Africare guarantees 50% and then 25% of the second loan and then zero. And the farmers have successfully continued for 15 years now to be able to develop a relationship with the bank, give them that access to financing, which also gives them that access to choice. So I think that piece about sort of the technical support, if you will, and the financing is very important to this question of sustainability around the private sector and smallholder farmer relationship.
Thank you. I'll let Professor Dani Khamovich have the final word or question. Are you going to ask something or announce lunch? Okay. Yeah.
Julian, and maybe anyone else, if you wanted to comment on it, talk for a second about the ethics of technology adoption versus the ethics of keeping technology. You know, we talk about, dangers. But what's the danger of not adopting a technology?
Golden rice.
Yeah, well, golden rice is a very good example. Danny, I'll refer you to a piece of work we did in 2008, which was ethics of agricultural technologies. It's on the EGE website, and it's getting on for 200 pages. So I'm not going to quote it now, but I think it's worth reading for exactly the point you make. We did talk very much about the three questions: the benefits of using a technology, the risks of using the technology, and the benefits and risks. It's four. The benefits and risks of not using the technology, which is more important actually. Can we maintain that which we've been doing effectively? Can we improve that which we are doing now? What are the risks associated with it to other things like the environment? We really need to take all of those into account. I'm not pro-GM, I'm not anti-GM. All I want to know is what are the pros and cons of using it and of not using it. And there are many obvious statements for different crops, for different traditions. So the question is really an important one, and I'll refer you to our opinion. It's very interesting. The group that I lead in Brussels is supposed to be dealing with bio issues, and all of us are bio background, if I can use that term. And then, well, yeah, exactly. But then in about 2000, I'm getting interference from my side. As usual from Jonathan. We got a phone call from the President of the European Council. There was a huge argument in the Council between Sarkozy and Merkel about energy and the production of energy. So we looked at the way in which energy is produced in Europe and the ethics and all the issues. And again, I'll refer you to that, is to have a good look at the manner in which the ethical balances need to be addressed, and they're not easy. From security of supply, which is what we're talking about here, but for food. But in that case, it's for whether we should trust Russia, all the way through to the incredible effects of coal on the population, both where it's burnt, but also where it is mined. Merkel wanted us very much to say nuclear energy is dangerous and shouldn't be used in Europe. The result was we said coal is dangerous and shouldn't be used in Europe.
So let's take a final question from this side of the audience.
Around in 2008, there was she and Paris got together a bunch of Nobel Prize winners around Israel's 60th anniversary and gave them each a chance to speak. And one of them, a biologist from Stanford, talked about how deeply he was mourning now the lack of public funding for research in health. And he gave the example, he said, you have two research projects, one of which will produce a pill, you take the pill and you don't have cancer anymore. The other one will produce a pill that you have to take 5 times a day, you'll live for 2 more years and then you'll die. He said, which of them will the private sector, which is now really in control of research, fund? And he said, not only will they fund the second one every time, but decisions like that are made every single week in American academia. Isn't our food system too important to put into the hands of a private sector? Right now, companies like Monsanto, or really Monsanto itself, are in charge of they really have what we call a monopoly over the seed industry. Shouldn't we be looking for a way to redress the problem of the balance of power? Shouldn't we be looking for a way for the public sector, also this person added, the biologist, that all the major breakthroughs in science that led to breakthroughs in longevity really happened in the 20th century through public funding of basic research. Isn't our food system too important to leave to the private sector? And how can we redress that balance of power?
That was a really good framing for what I wanted to close with, and I'll let you have the final word, of course. But I just put an image that was recently circulated in the Israeli media, a response to the selling of Tnuva, our major dairy producer in Israel, a company that was sort of like a governmental company because its story is integrated with the story of sovereignty in Israel. It broke the siege to Jerusalem to bring milk to the Jerusalem kids, and it was delivered to remote posts in the military, etc., etc. And the response in the Israeli media to its selling to the Chinese government was, it's like selling the home, because Tnuva, that this is a pagoda, but usually on the cottage cheese there is an Israeli home. Okay, so I think that really exemplifies your point. Now, you remember I told you about this strip club dilemma. I want to tell you how I figured it out, how we solved this in our clinic, and ask you to maybe take those two questions together, and we'll wrap things up and go to lunch. So I approached the dilemma from the question, like Gwen said, who is we? So what institutional or organizational perspective we're talking about? If I'm a lawyer, okay, and I'm a human rights lawyer, I shouldn't take this case because I have limited resources. Having said that, if I'm the last lawyer on earth, I should represent those Arab guys who wanted to enter the strip club because they are discriminated on the basis of nationality. Now, if I am the court and they bring the case through another lawyer, of course the court should say, this is discrimination, and if Jews are allowed to strip clubs, then Palestinians should be allowed either. Now, often what courts do, and this is to Ian's point about the fundamentally distorted structure of all of this, what courts often do is they send such plaintiffs back home to say, listen, we ourselves cannot let you discriminate, objectify women, and rule for you on the issue of nationality because you are asking us to use an anti-discrimination argument or an equality argument in order to oppress another group and sustain inequality. Okay? And I think that's wrong. That's yet again hurting the little guy. So I hope I made myself clear, and I'm wondering whether that makes sense to you, and how do you respond to those two previous questions and comments?
I actually just want to sort of tie that comment and question to that comment and question, potentially back to the opening speech, and then I guess my question, which sounds egotistical, but it's all about sort of who's the champion of this and who are the stakeholders, right? When you look at, agriculture's on the agenda now, technology's on the agenda now, innovation's on the agenda. In the HIV/AIDS sphere, but what did it take for antiretroviral treatment to happen? It took a huge champion. And as former Secretary General Kofi Annan said, it took the minute that Richard Holbrooke called him and said, this is a national security agenda issue right now. And it took that driving force to get it on the Security Council, but to get it in the minds of Clinton and Bush and the others in the U.S. government, and to get it in the minds of getting the private sector to the table, say, here's what you have to do to make things accessible. So I think for me it goes back to, it's got to be on sort of everybody's agenda. And it's got to be a champion where it rides up at that level where we're saying, this is our food, this is the basic things of what we do. But it has to be on everybody's agenda. It can't be just one person. And that's why, the we and what we're saying is so important to me, because you can say one thing, the government can say another. But until it rises up and somebody really takes this as this champion thing for the moral dilemma of how do we feed the world, we're getting there. We wouldn't have had this conference 15 years ago. I don't think so. But we're having it now. We wouldn't have maybe had it at the level of all of the people across the world. But I will pass that down to the experts on that question.
I'd just like to answer, the last question was very important. And I gave an example of where the public sector did something, and the public sector can get back in the game again, as well as a new sector that's come into the game now called the do-it-yourselfers. There are do-it-yourself labs all over the United States now. And it's because all the intellectual property on genetic engineering, the basic intellectual property is off patent. So there's a new group getting in, and there's also in the United States another group in the USDA that helps on the registration called IR4. So the public sector and this new do-it-yourself sector, which is super public sector, can get in the game. Eventually, the private sector has to get involved because it's the seed companies or the similar has to disseminate the technologies when they come out.
Okay, I love the title of the legislation passed, particularly in the United States, at the beginning of the 20th century to break up cartels. It's called the antitrust legislation, implying trust. The theory is that government controls monopolies, and government assures that monopolies don't occur. In practice, the monopolies are multinational or international, and we have no control. So the question is really a very important one. I was trying to look up now, while my colleagues were talking, the percentage of the seed market controlled by Monsanto. I do know how much of the transgenic seed market they control. It's 80%. But I don't know the overall seed market all over the world, because Limogren is pretty big, and Syngenta and Pioneer, DuPont are huge as well. But the problem is not just one company, but a number of big companies are controlling the seed industry. You're right. The same is true of pharmaceuticals. The same is true of computers. The same is true of telephones. And how are we handling that? We do actually have an interesting way of handling it to some extent, and that is that we have, at least in the telecommunications system, an agreement on a common standard. And that's quite an interesting one. The requirement, and we've talked about this in plants as well, the requirement to share technologies which are considered essential. And we've started to talk about that amongst the IP, including the anti-IP people around the world. But it's a very difficult one to address. Possibly UN is needed for this, or WTO.
Just back to this point of this, to redress the balance, your point about the public and private R&D. And remember, I spent 18 years as a public R&D scientist making the case for public R&D. And just to make our foundation as a matter of record, you know, for every dollar we might put into private R&D, we put $10 into public R&D. So we're strong supporters of public R&D. I think Jonathan's point is actually really important. If we should be able to find these, the decline in funding into public R&D. Why is that? I don't follow the logic that it's the fault of the private sector. I don't follow that logic. It may be. I guess it's the taxpayer, isn't it? What are we doing? We're asking the taxpayer to put their hand in their pocket. But I suppose, if I can just finish, is if we can get into these win-win situations where we get the public and the private sector working together to deliver what we want for smallholder farmers, I think we can then go back and more easily make the case for investment in public R&D. Would you say we have to set rules, we have to set boundaries? And, thank you.
So I guess nobody else. Lunch. Thank you very much, everybody.